There's a quote from Virginia Woolf's The Waves that I always thought was a great summary of her work as a whole. I am made and remade continually. Different people draw different words from me. Having read 4 of Woolf's novels, it's this sense of being remade that always made me feel like I was just often reading drafts or revisions of one attempt at one singular work. And across reading all of the characters in Woolf's work that I've read so far, they always feel like they're at the mercy of Woolf's sense of story and narrative, affecting them like a symptom of the flu that someone would try to accommodate and endure. It seems Woolf likes to sever the tie between character and life intentionally within her work, often reinforcing this lack of control. I especially think this is evident with how she writes and sets up her stories in general, with these patterns of paragraph often creating this distinction. Again, from The Waves, in one paragraph it says, "Thus I visited each of my friends in turn, trying with fumbling fingers to prise open their locked caskets. I went from one to the other holding my sorrow. No, not my sorrow, but the incomprehensible nature of this, our life, for their inspection." And then immediately the paragraph right after this one says, "Should this be the end of the story, a kind of sigh, a last ripple of the wave, a trickle of water in some gutter where, burbling, it dies away? Let me touch the table, so, and thus recover my sense of the moment. A sideboard covered with cruets, a basket full of rolls, a plate of bananas, these are comfortable sighs. But if there are no stories, what end can there be?" There's often this quick switch of one paragraph leading to some sort of character action, and then the paragraph after immediately getting into some deep existential inquiry. Woolf creates this volley of story and life musings, and I think she does so in a way to constantly retest how her characters can advocate for leading towards a conscious and meaningful life, and how this power of choice can make them feel more in control. So that's to say, are Woolf's characters really like the most impressionable to me or memorable? I would say overall not really, but I do think of them as some of the most eager and embarrassed and ambitious and curious characters I've read in my whole reading life, because they try to prolong this sense of reaching towards meaning or investigating life in general. So while all of Woolf's characters to me have this collective conscious, I always thought that Woolf was someone that really cared much more about theme and story instead of character, or how they affect characters directly. In a way, I feel like that's her own stance at trying to tell readers that an embodiment of a writer's life or their sense of their work could never be contained within one novel or one story. On the surface, I do think that the books I've read by Woolf so far can be easily generalized into really familiar themes. The Waves is the one on friendship, To the Lighthouse is the one on family, Orlando is the one on identity, and Mrs. Dalloway is the one on solitude. These all feel like themes that could really just boil down to being a foundation for any given human experience. I think that Woolf puts herself in this role to feel responsible to expand on these foundational themes while also chiseling away at the characters that she gives readers, often by reestablishing the misconceptions that characters have about each other throughout the story. A lot of this is fueled by early character interactions that often come with an air of disruption and disappointment instead of feeling like any graceful encounter. In To the Lighthouse, we have Mrs. Ramsay suggest to her son James that they can see the lighthouse, only to be shot down by Mr. Ramsay. In The Waves, we find Susan, who has a crush on Louis, find Ginny and Louis kissing. So it's these earlier disruptions that sort of also make the initial themes that I mentioned for each book earlier kind of give the opportunity to organically reshape and remold into other themes, commonly like death. I think that death is Woolf's most defining theme because it asks the most out of its characters. Ultimately, I think that Woolf emphasizes that our sense of self is always evasive, which is why we need others to serve as a way to see mirrors of ourselves by building relationships. Once chosen or born into, evident of the quote I read at the beginning of this video about being remade continually. But it's not all doom and gloom, because I think with mostly all of the character interactions across Woolf's work that I've read so far, It's all pretty much positive, and this positivity is often only realized once characters establish a meaningful connection with other people. For example, with a quote on friendship from The Waves, it reads, "Our friends, how seldom visited, how little known. It is true, and yet, when I meet an unknown person and try to break off, here at this table, what I call my life, it is not one life that I look back upon. I am not one person, I am many people. I do not altogether know who I am, Jenny, Susan, Neville, Rhoda, or Louis, or how to distinguish my life from theirs." Also, Woolf advocates that even if you have established meaningful connection with others, you're allowed to keep this sense of privacy with your own self-reflection. And to the lighthouse, Woolf writes, "There it was before her, life. Life, she thought, but she did not finish her thought. She took a look at life, for she had a clear sense of it there, something real, something private, which she shared neither with her children nor with her husband." With these two quotes I just read, it's also good to point out that Woolf never makes us choose which one we have a preference for. We're allowed to admit that our sense of feelings are always in process. And process is so important to Woolf's characters because they often have to feel so much while also considering others around them. It's through these revelations that many of Woolf's characters have that also ask some leading questions that I often found asking myself as I read her work. How can my feelings tied to places change? Who am I in the thoughts and gaze of my friends? How can a single day change me completely? Mrs. Dalloway, which is probably Woolf's most prolific work, has always interested me. It's funny because in hindsight now, I consider Mrs. Dalloway to feel like an homage to Woolf's work, even though it was published before To the Lighthouse and The Waves. Having Mrs. Dalloway take place only in a single day nearly feels like a punishment with Woolf's other books, considering how freely her other work bends time and place. Time is important because it often is the thing responsible for helping Woolf's characters reach their revelations over time, inwardly with things about life and even externally with time-sensitive events, like the idea of needing to get ready for a party in both Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, even as both Mrs. Dalloway and Mrs. Ramsay realize the attempt to cling to meaning through events is futile. Into the lighthouse, at the height of the dinner party, Mrs. Ramsay finally asks herself, what am I doing with my life? And indirectly in Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa hears about a particular character in this story and what happened to him, and this causes her to really reflect on life entirely. I appreciate how Woolf never makes it feel like having to think about life is a priority, and I love her commitment to what I can only describe as a gentleness and patience with her sense of writing and storytelling, steering readers along the way to reach these revelations that could very well possibly make people feel more inwardly and I guess existentially about the world, but that doesn't mean it has to be negative. The self-reflection she often has her characters go through always feel like it's in their best interest or a way to better themselves. The bare bones that comes with much of the plot throughout Woolf's books not really having any plot, I think is a way of Woolf realizing that many people in the world feel like there's this generalization that we have to get up every day and do what we're supposed to do because we just have to. It's not always the case now that I feel like life has to happen to me in order to have a reaction to it. Instead, I feel more capable to feel more empathetic towards the people around me, like my friends and my family. And when it comes to reading, I think that reading shares this same serendipity of treading into the unknown and not really being sure of what you're going to feel or how you react to something you might read in any type of fiction. And so to end this video, I wanted to read a quote from Mrs. Dalloway. "It was very, very dangerous to live even one day, not because life is so perilous, but because it is so momentous.